Greetings and welcome everyone to the inaugural Cambridge Festival, the university's biggest public engagement celebration, bringing together the Cambridge Science Festival and the Cambridge Festival of Ideas. I am Dr. Ahmed Hankir. I'm also known as the Wounded Healer. I'm a psychiatrist working in the front line of our beloved NHS at Maudsley Hospital in London. And I am also a senior research fellow at the Center for Mental Health Research in association with the University of Cambridge. I am deeply honored and humbled to be chairing a panel discussion on mental health and well-being for young people in an age of insecurity. We have a stellar lineup of speakers who, during this session, will each give a short talk, which will then be followed up by a panel discussion addressing the impact not just of the pandemic and its economic aftermath on young people's well-being, but of other pre-existing factors affecting their mental health. First up, we have Dr. Duncan Astle, who is program leader at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit at the University of Cambridge and fellow of Robinson College. Duncan's program is dedicated to understanding trajectories of cognitive development, their underpinning neurobiology, and the factors that guide their origins during childhood. Next, we have Dr. Joe Dillabough, who is reader in the Sociology of Youth and Global Cultures. Joe's work focuses on questions about how transnational urban change impacts upon intergenerational youth disadvantage, particularly as it pertains to the intersection of legacies of colonialism, austerity, populism, race, protracted displacement, war, conflict, and youth surveillance in regions and spaces across the world. A tough act to follow, I know, but no doubt Brendan Burchell will rise to the challenge. Brendan is professor in the social sciences department at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Magdalen College. Brendan's research interests include how good or bad employment can be beneficial or harmful to individual well-being, and the possibility of a future society where we all work less. Just imagine that. And lastly, but by no means the least, we have Anne-Laura van Haarmalen, who is professor of brain safety and resilience at the Institute of Education and Child Studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands and senior affiliate at the Department of Psychiatry in Cambridge University. Anne-Laura's research focuses on examining the brain mechanisms of risk and resilience in young people. And so, without further ado, I will hand the microphone over to Duncan to kickstart this session. Duncan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Real pleasure to join you and pleasure to have this discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. So I thought I would start by talking a little bit about the backdrop before the pandemic, because that kind of context is really important to understand when we're trying to interpret the impact of the pandemic on young people's well-being. So it's always hard to estimate the relative prevalence of mental health difficulties, but in 2017, we can estimate that about 1 in 8, so about 13% of 5 to 19-year-olds had at least one recognized mental health difficulty when they were assessed. We know that from kind of large national surveys that we run routinely in the UK. And rates of mental health difficulties have increased with age. So for a young primary school child, so someone who's just maybe 4 years old, only be about 5%. whereas someone who's more like 17 to 19, that'd be more like 17%. And before the pandemic arrived, we were already struggling to meet this need. So despite increases in funding for child and adolescent mental health services, also called CAMS, we already reject about 26% of referrals. And despite that, we still have quite lengthy waiting lists. Also, young people may not realize that they're experiencing symptoms of things like anxiety and depression, that it's influencing their everyday lives. And the end result is that we estimate that only about a quarter of young people who have impairing levels of mental health difficulties are actually able to access CAMS services. And in reality, school ends up being the most commonly approached kind of service for mental health difficulties. So when the pandemic hits, that's the context. So mental health difficulties are already increasing in children and adolescents. And it's challenging to meet that demand, and with many kids receiving formal or informal support in their schools. So what happens when the pandemic arrives? Well, there are a number of studies now that are emerging, and the best of those usually have baseline data. So the kids have already been seen before the pandemic arrives, so that we can assess the relative impact of the pandemic. So rates of probable mental health difficulties have increased. So in 2020, it's more like 1 in 6, so 16% of 5 to 16-year-olds, relative to only around 11% in 2017. And this increase is relatively equally evident in boys and girls. But as people get older, that relative increase goes up, and it starts to differentiate by age. So you see that it's much higher for girls than it is for boys. So young women, for example, aged 17 to 22, about 27% of them have a mental health difficulty that's recognized, versus only about 13 to 14% of boys. So systems are already challenged before the pandemic arrives, and most evidence now suggests that the pandemic has exacerbated or increased those mental health difficulties. That chimes with our own studies. So we've done a study that showed increases in depression symptoms in primary school children, so kind of 7, 8, 9 years old. Other studies have shown effects of anxiety and depression in adolescents. And finally, the much larger studies have been able to explore what are the potential risk factors for those who are most likely to experience the biggest drop in mental health. And those risk factors so far have included experiencing adults arguing in the house, sleep problems, though it's hard to know about cause and consequence there, families encountering financial difficulties, and unsurprisingly, those who say their lives have got worse during lockdown. And so I think that that is a decent summary of where we were before the pandemic hit and the headlines of what we think has happened during the pandemic.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Duncan, for your very insightful and consciousness raising talk. I'll hand over to Joe.
Lovely, thank you. It's fabulous to be at the event, and I really appreciate the invite, and a pleasure to be with everyone here today. And thank you, Haarmalen, for a wonderful introduction. Interestingly, that we started with a preemptive account before the pandemic, and I have done something quite similar. And I will be speaking very generally in a quite different way about the circumstances, but I think they relate very well. And so one of the things I think is very important when we're thinking about young people's well-being is to take into account a pre-figurative space before the pandemic itself, and ask questions about what was the state of young people's lives in the world in the early 21st century. And most particularly the growth in youth inequality. I happen to be an urban studies specialist, so that inequality and growth in cities around the world. And the questions that we need to ask then is, what has the pandemic then done to exacerbate historical problems of already existing disadvantage, and particularly the intersection between austerity, marginal young lives, and what is becoming increasingly the case around the world as normalized precarity. The other important point is, and this is where, sociology and politics come into the picture here, is to consider what's actually happening in the changing world of politics and how that actually affects young people in those contexts. So we see a rise in populist and authoritarian political parties as a result of, in part, austerity, alongside growing anti-immigration sentiment, young people living in protracted displacement in spaces that are, in many cases, unlivable and challenging. And the pandemic has only made that circumstance much, much worse for people. But what's important to remember is not simply the stigma attached to those groups, which is, the obvious thing we hear in the media, but more importantly, the ways in which the state deals with those spaces, because those become spaces of expulsion where neglect is a forefront of how the state is dealing with those circumstances. So, the situation of the pandemic has only really worsened that. We also need to think about another factor, which I think is really important, which is sort of the politics and political economy of urbanization itself. And what we do know is that spaces, global cities in particular, are becoming increasingly defensive spaces. So high security regimes, the privatization of public space, and growing precarity in spaces of disadvantage there. And this is what a scholar called Nixon refers to as slow violence. The slow violence young people are experiencing in these, what we might say, urban zones of disenfranchisement, or ambivalent zones where young people don't have a sense of direction and are striving to make sense of that. And what's also important is then to take into consideration the question of imperialism and colonialism in that project. So the legacies, for example, in South Africa of apartheid, earlier expulsions, these are appearing during the pandemic in a much more extreme form. We're starting to see those legacies reemerge in a more extreme form. It's not the same time period, but in fact, those divisions in the city are showing a face in a way that might be reminiscent of that time period. So the key things to be thinking about here are not just the question of the young people themselves, although that's crucial, but the structural forces that are shaping those realities and that existed before the pandemic itself. And it's really important the public understand that when they actually begin to see the challenges young people are facing. The next thing to remember here is particular groups, and I think this is really very important. So what particular groups might be most affected when we're thinking about it from this angle? So we might be thinking about refugee youth who don't have access to education in the same way, or groups of people who might be in settlements where access to technology becomes really challenging. So the idea of saying, well, we'll be doing things online means that there's another gap there, a kind of slippage for those particular young people. And then we have to think again about how those people are treated as non-citizens in those spaces. Access to other kinds of resources become a real problem. I think the final thing to say, and I hope this links up with other talks we have today, is services as a consequence. So we also need to think about services and not just, how we're meant to help young people in these particular situations, but what we know about the way services are operating in many cities in what we might call, in inverted commas, the global north. Services are compromised, privatized, contracted out. People are competing for those services. So when we heard Duncan talk about access, I think that's really important. What's available, where the spaces are. Schools themselves are under pressure and feel that pressure very substantially. So the idea that there might be support there, of course, is crucial, but it's very difficult for people in schools themselves. The commodification of those services, if you think about refugees trying to seek support in spaces where migration services themselves or support services are contracted out to private organizations that don't have a sense about where the public, if you like, is for these young people and what they're meant to be responding to. And there are negative socioeconomic impacts as a consequence. Finally, another really important thing in this context is the potential for violence and conflict to emerge. One of the things we know in more authoritarian spaces is that these young people are being targeted by authorities. And the international human rights community is encouraging nations to avoid, resist any kind of militarized response to the pandemic and the way they treat young people in these spaces. But we are seeing growing violence in these spaces, and it becomes a dehumanizing experience for the young people living there. This is also true in camps, and real questions about whether young people are seen and recognized as legitimate in these spaces. So these are some of the critical social, economic, and political circumstances I think might stand behind some of the things that will be shared by others today. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Joe, for that terrific talk and for highlighting some incredibly important points, especially about how the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing inequalities. And we'll expand upon that in the panel discussion. Brendan, I did say it was a tough act to follow, but I also said that no doubt you will rise to the challenge. So the gauntlet has been thrown. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm interested in people's lives and why there is so much variation in people's mental health or well-being. And in particular, I'm interested in what happens to people after they leave full-time education. And for many people then, that's entering the world of work. And some of those people will be really flourishing, able to fully enjoy life to the full, be able to take challenges, be resilient against them. And then at the other end of the spectrum, as Duncan was saying, there are people who suffer symptoms of anxiety and depression. And we can look using often big data sets. That's what I do a lot of the time. We can see what causes that variation. And of course, there are lots of things, again, as Duncan and Joe have pointed to. But one of the most important things in people's lives at that point, and this is something that affects very large numbers of people's, is where they are in terms of employment. And we see huge differences, particularly, and I'll start with just having a job rather than being unemployed makes this very massive difference. When we look at the graphs, when we look at all the data on well-being, being in a job is enormously protective of people's well-being. And you might think, well, the obvious reason for that is because of poverty, because of the wage you get, because it enables you to do so many more things if you've got your own income, particularly as a young person setting off in life, finding your way forward. A surprise finding, though, is that actually that financial side of things, and this is true in UK, in European countries, and to a slightly lesser extent when we look globally, it's not the wage, it's other things, it's something else about jobs that is good for people's mental health. What are those things? And there's been some argument about this, but there's a lot of consensus too among social scientists that having a job in some ways holds you in a healthy environment. It gives you a structure around your time. It allows you to know when you should be working, when you can have time to yourself, to your family, for your caring responsibilities, for leisure time, for community activities. That's structuring around time, which unemployed people find very hard to do. It keeps you busy. It stops you ruminating and worrying too much. It gives you shared goals. It gives you a sense that you're not just in this world to look after yourself, but by working together with other people in organizations, you can achieve things that are important to you and important to other people. It gives you wider social networks. You're not stuck at home only interacting with your own family, which can, as we know, for young people, be a very emotionally charged environment. It gets you out to just that wider, less emotionally involved social networks. And it affects the way that you see yourself, your own identity, and it affects the way that other people see you, because unfortunately, but we are still very much judged by where we are in the labour market in this society today. Of course, there are concerns. We've had periods of mass unemployment on and off through the last 100 years, that we could be coming up to another period. We're already facing that with the pandemic. And that's why it's so important, of all the other government priorities, but keeping people in employment is, I would say, the single most important way which as a society we can prevent mass misery, mass mental health problems. There are people who are thinking that it's very difficult to achieve. And maybe one of the answers that people are talking about is universal basic incomes. Well, if people can't work, if we don't have jobs for everyone, then at least we can prevent poverty. And of course, preventing poverty, giving people a respect, respect through income is important. But I think we absolutely have to look at the psychological side of that, of keeping people engaged. It's one of the ways in which people stay connected to society through employment, and even more so for young people when they're making that difficult transition. The thing I've been doing most recently is looking at how much of this paid work we need in our lives. And one very clear but somewhat surprising finding I've come up with is that you actually don't need that much. Actually, working even one day a week is much better for you than having no job at all. So even if there aren't jobs around because of the pandemic, or because in the near future robots and artificial are going to take away jobs, keeping everybody with some paid work, I think, is so important for that stability, for people to know where they're going in life, having a clear path through that transition. Of course, there are good jobs and bad jobs. There are some jobs now where people are not respected, they're not doing things that they see as meaningful, maybe they're being bullied in the workplace, where there's a lot of stress on them in the workplace, and of course that's a bad thing. There's a massive difference between good jobs and bad jobs, but most jobs are much better than being unemployed. And that's, I think, something we absolutely have to remember for young people as they go through their late teens and early 20s. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan, for a brilliant talk, which resonated with me, and I'm sure will resonate with many other people. As I mentioned, I work in the front line of the NHS during the pandemic, and people often ask me, Dr. Hanker, aren't you burning out? And I actually feel really fortunate that I have job security, and not only job security, but as a doctor, I feel valued and respected. So yeah, really resonates with me. Thank you, Brendan, for discussing these critical points. And lastly, but as I said, by no means the least, Laura.
Thank you, Ahmed. So Duncan has detailed really nicely the effects of COVID-related stress on mental health in adolescents, and shown that the pandemic has worsened mental health problems in children and adolescents. Now, to reduce these effects and to lessen the burden on kind of systems, it's really important that we focus on better understanding how we can build resilience in young people. Now, my research focuses on just that question. How can resilience be achieved in young people after stress, in response to stress? Now, resilience, like intelligence, is a concept that lots of people know of, but they all have different ideas of what it means. Most often, people think that resilience is a thing that is innate, that some people have, and that protects them against the effects of stress. Now, we know of many factors that might make young people vulnerable to stress. Duncan and Joe have mentioned a few of these factors. Another strong risk factor for mental health problems in adolescence is a history of abuse and neglect in the home environment. But despite these risk factors, we know, and Brendan also mentioned this, that not all individuals with these risk factors develop mental health problems. Some young people are resilient to stress. And if we could only measure this resilience with a test to take someone's resilience temperature, we would be able to predict who will and who won't develop mental health problems after stress. And we could focus our efforts now on those most vulnerable to COVID-related stress. Wouldn't that be nice? Unfortunately, our research has shown that it's much more complex than that. Over 50 years of research has shown that resilience isn't a thing that is stable. Rather, resilience refers to a process of responding well to stress. And it's built up by three things, on three aspects. It refers to your capacity to respond well to future stress. But it also refers to your actual response in the face of stress. And it refers to the outcome in the aftermath of a stressor. It refers to how much better you're doing compared to others with similar experiences. We also know that someone's resilience isn't stable, but rather it's dynamic and it can change over time. And it can be strengthened if only that person is provided with the right resources. Now, we call these resources protective or resilience factors. And these factors lie on many different levels, both within the body, but also outside the body. For instance, our research has shown that recalling positive memories in the face of stress, so thinking about that really positive thing that happened to you, helps. We also show that higher self-esteem, more positive appraisal of events, and better regulation of stress responses in the brain help aid resilience in adolescents. But we also showed that one of the most strongest predictors of resilience in young people is social support from their friends. And what's most important is that these factors, they don't work in isolation, but rather they are inextricably intertwined. So your genetic profile shapes the way that your brain responds to stress, but so do your friendships and your family support. And what's even more important is that the resilience of an individual is highly influenced by its context, meaning that the resilience of individuals is aided by resilient families that are shaped by resilient societies and resilient cultures, and that these systems all influence each other in bi-directional ways. Now, this has really important implications, because it means that a young person's ability to respond well to stress in terms of COVID relies on a wide range of factors, both within and outside their body, and thus that there is no such thing as a resilience gene or a resilience personality, and that there's no lab test that can measure how someone's going to do or how someone's going to respond to stress. But it's not all bleak. It also means that resilience can be boosted by providing young people with the resilience factors, with resources and skills that they need to better cope with stress. And thus there are many concrete things that families, schools and workplaces, but even the culture can do to support young people to build resilience to COVID-related stress. For instance, social media can help us remember the specifics of positive memories, to help us remember and recall these really nice things that happened to us. For instance, by highlighting photos that young people previously indicated to be positive. Journaling might help remember the specifics of positive interactions, and schools and families and teachers can also play a critical role in facilitating resilience in young people by providing the necessary tools for positive peer interactions, showing how to care for your friends. And schools can set up buddy systems or after school clubs or exercises for positive peer interaction strategies in the curriculum. As such, the saying, "It takes a village to raise a child," also applies to that child's resilience. That village can really raise a child. Thank you.
What a wonderful talk. Thank you, Laura. I think it's so easy to succumb to despair in this pandemic and the age of social media and all this doom scrolling. And I mean, really, thank you again for instilling hope that there is light in the end of the tunnel, and that we do have some of the kind of tools, or we can certainly equip our youth with the tools and mechanisms to develop resilience. That is the final talk. I want to thank all the speakers. I thought that was really powerful. And now we have about 20 minutes or so. We're going to open it up to a panel discussion. It's going to be free-flowing. It's going to be dynamic. And we're going to invite each speaker to kind of make further comments or maybe even to challenge each other, obviously in a constructive way. But yeah, this is really kind of an opportunity to maybe delve deeper into some of the topics that we discussed so far. So I'll invite anyone who would like to say something or contribute or ask a question, or I could start if you don't have any takers.
Yeah, I'll start. Something I noticed across all the talks is that I don't think anyone was suggesting, I know in the pandemic, we've all used the word unprecedented and, once in a generation, et cetera, but I don't think anyone really suggested that the challenges that we're facing are something totally new, but rather that they're riding on the back of trends that have been emerging in society and culture for decades. And that they provide a kind of pinch point, a kind of moment in which many things are kind of exacerbated. but they're not the same as, it's not the same as saying that it's something that's totally new that we haven't encountered before. So for example, we did a study on people in the 1970 birth cohort when they were 10 years old versus 16. And so that was like back in the 1980s. And we showed that looking at that data, that there was a real transition in the type of behavioral and mental health difficulties children had versus those that were 16-year-olds who are adolescents. And you could predict some of those transitions by the kind of resources and socioeconomic standing that the kids had. And it seems to me that the challenges that we're facing now are kind of like exacerbated versions of many of the relationships that we have known about for some time.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that. Does anybody have any response to Duncan's comments?
I'd certainly back
Brendan?
that up from
Yeah.
From looking at labour markets, and clearly there've been ups and downs. And when I started studying, the thing that got me interested in this area was in the 1980s, when there was unemployment was far higher than anything we've seen since. And there was even a sense then that we were never going to go back to full employment or anything near it. And now I think we do accept that we are going to recover. You know, we do have ups and downs. We also have had the chance to look at those people who are most challenged in that transition from school to work. What happens to them later when they get into their 30s and 40s? And lots of people talk about the scarring effect. And there are long-term effects, but they tend to be slight. So I think the word scarring is an overestimate, that it does catastrophize it somewhat. Most people do recover, they get back onto the ladder, and you know, they're not, it doesn't mark out their life in a big way. So yeah, I think people are generally, maybe looking at in terms of resilience, there are levels of resilience in the population, and for those normal effects that people get, the normal setbacks they have in those transitions aren't going to make them, you know, have a life of misery ahead of them. They are still going to have good lives in most cases.
Thank you, Brendan. I think both of you have made some incredibly important points, and I think and Laura, was there something that you wanted to say, or Joe, kind of building on that, or?
Yes, definitely. So I just wanted to echo what Brendan was saying, that research in my field, childhood stress, is especially relevant here. And what we know is that children and young people are surprisingly resilient most often when they experience a stressor, a traumatic event, or a environmental stressor like a flood or a hurricane. We know that from these studies that the most often response that young people show is resilience. So it's when we look at that literature and learn from that literature, we actually know what the tools are and what the facets are that help young people. So I think that we can really build on this long history of resilience research and apply that here.
Fantastic. Well, it might be obvious. I'm from a Black, Asian, and minority ethnic background, or BAME, and I'm deeply concerned about the impact that COVID-19 is having on people from BAME backgrounds. And Joe, I mean, can I invite you to make some comments about the kind of the consequences of the pandemic on kind of marginalized or minority groups, not just in the UK, but other regions and places throughout the world?
Absolutely. So it's very interesting that we're also thinking, back in time, and I think that's a really useful thing to put in front of us as we talk about the pandemic, because one of the things that happens is that unless people have a sense about a history for a particular group of people and the way that they have been treated in various places across the globe, the pandemic becomes the thing that configures how they think about what's actually happening to people. And we do know that, as I'd mentioned in the first part of the talk, is that there are particular groups that get targeted in those circumstances, and they get targeted because they're already seen as abject or stigmatized, problematic for the state. And, you know, there are a number of things I think that are important about thinking about, is this new or not? I mean, we've been through many different generations of political crises across the world. But knowing that history becomes really crucial, because once we accept in principle, you know, who's been deemed the most legitimate group, we know that they survive better in these moments of crisis. Now, that doesn't mean, and that in no way does that mean, that groups from minority backgrounds are not resilient and are not struggling to do that. What it does mean is that they're put in much more difficult circumstances in terms of trying to respond. So we might be talking about minority ethnics in particular spaces. So I mentioned the migrant community, but also we might be talking about people who are in the UK who are living in very difficult circumstances in communities that have been left behind by the state. We could be thinking the Northeast or the Northwest, particularly in the UK. Groups that are, and this, we also know this was a hotspot. These were hotspots for the pandemic. And what's actually going on there is already existing tensions between longstanding white working class communities, for example, and other minority groups, racialized groups. And these tensions are playing out on the ground for these communities. And as a consequence of that, you know, when we think about the pandemic, we think about how it fuels more tension, how it encourages things like race hatred. And I think that the race hatred thing is a really huge thing that we're really not talking about enough. So it's crucial that we actually work out, you know, the individual consequences for young people. But if we don't tackle the socio-structural realities and the race histories of a place, we still won't get the full picture, because the reality is that the effects are just so much greater on those particular groups. And what happens is it starts to play out in young people's relationships with each other.
Yes.
So you start to begin to see peer related conflict across groups. And these crises, what they do, these, you know, what we might call inverted crises, is they intervene into these relationships and heighten conflict for young people, because young people are taking on these discourses of the state. And we might be thinking about it, you know, in relationship to other things. For example, Brexit being, you know, one of those things we might call a state crisis of a kind that is also playing into this story around particular groups, sort of being legitimate here or not during the pandemic, and increasing exercised, energized violence on the internet directed towards particular groups. So, you know, we've got a number of things playing into that are, you know, precisely about that already existing reality for young people.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. I mean, it's really, honestly, it's comforting that this is being acknowledged and validated. And I'd like to invite the other speakers if they have any comments on that topic in particular, or.
I think I'd like to add to that and say that maybe the backdrop to a lot of the problems we've got in the UK today for young people is because we've got so much inequality, and that fuels the sort of certainly perceived, if not real, competition between people from different groups, whether it's competition for jobs or competition in all sorts of other ways. Because there's not only competition to get jobs, but very clearly there's some very good jobs out there sought after, and some very poor jobs out there. And again, Joe mentioned precarity, jobs where there's little way in which you could see a good future to that job. And as long as we have that inequality, it makes all these other problems so much more difficult to deal with. And I think that's maybe, you know, we have to realize we are a much more unequal society than we were 50 years ago. And until we can really deal with that, it's just so much more difficult to deal with all sorts of other well-being issues.
Absolutely.
Can I ask a question related to that? So when you talk about inequality, I completely agree with everything you've said. Let's say that first. But when we talk about inequality and its effects on young people, it's easy to think, well, that's not something that I can do anything about. It's something that needs to be addressed on a higher structure in terms
Like
of politics and
policy level, yeah.
on exactly on a policy level, but that might also make people a bit more lazy, a bit more like, oh, I can't do anything about it, so never mind. And what would you answer to that?
Well, maybe I could come back to that. I don't know if that was meant for me and Laura, but
I don't think there's anyone more qualified to come back to that. So over certainly in this panel. So please, by all means, do.
Yeah. Well, let's hope. Let's hope. And I mean, I guess I want to just start by saying I completely appreciate the hopefulness that comes from the work that you're doing and the direction of travel that it's meant to go. And I think we need all different kinds of expertise to tackle these problems. The challenge is that what happens, I think, is political communities respond better to the kinds of stories that are told by people who are working in these areas and projects. And there's nothing wrong with that, except for what it might mask for them, if that's the only thing that we're talking about, is what's not being done elsewhere. And it's not to be fatalistic about that particular project, it's to be a realist about it. And that's a tough call, because of course what we really need to be doing is sharing with political communities the realities of what governments are doing and not doing, and how we need to push for wider policy changes that would address some of these things. Now, what we know is in a very heightened neoliberalization of the state and its services, is that it's not necessarily listening. And in the increasing neoliberalization of services and the commodification, privatization of those services, you get a very fragmented community of service providers trying to respond to those issues. And I mean, I'm speaking about service providers, but I'm thinking about public, or what we might say in sociology, the left hand of the state. And, the reality is what's going on at the moment in many states in the world is the right hand of the state, the sort of economic side of it, the neoliberalization side of it, doesn't care about what the left hand is doing. I mean, that's something that comes from the work of a sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu. But in particular, when we think about how to deal with that, people need to understand what's in the background. And I don't want us to be pessimistic about potential, but I want us to be realists about what the states are doing. And if we see growing populism, growing authoritarianism, growing expulsions, the use of war, militarization to exclude people, those people who are not deemed legitimate will be left beyond any comprehension of services. And I guess one example I might want to give is, think about people who are in the midst of war. The young people that are being forced out of countries in the midst of war. So we could take the Syrian war as one particular case, but there are many other examples. I happened to work on a project related to the Syrian war with young students and academics who were forced into exile in Turkey. And one of the things we know now is, of course, Turkey is increasingly authoritarian. And as a consequence, young people who aren't seen as legitimate citizens there are facing a double expulsion. Now, in the middle of a pandemic, what would that mean? It means they're not only being forced out of Syria, they're being forced out of Turkey. And a lot of us don't know enough about these wider geopolitical conflicts and what they're actually doing to these particular groups, but they're being forced increasingly to move from state to state to find some sense of legitimacy. And I suppose we need that bigger politic in front of us to have a sense about what do we do about that at a much higher level, so that we have these coordinations across the kinds of things you do, in that very hopeful, practical, fundamental way. And also for us to be talking in a larger community that hasn't given up on politics to deal with these issues. I guess that would be that's my message.
Thank you for delivering that critical message. And I think we need to remind ourselves that the pandemic, COVID-19, it's a global problem that needs a global solution. And I mean, the Director General of the World Health Organization has raised concerns about how people, children, adolescents, and low and middle income countries are seemingly being neglected. So really need to emphasize that obviously the pandemic, it should be obvious that it's a global problem and it requires a global solution. So, I mean, this festival is, as you can see, it's online for obvious reasons. Otherwise, it would have been face to face. And kind of these digital platforms, they have advantages and disadvantages. But I wanted to get your thoughts on this being the digital age and being in the midst of the pandemic. The relationship that the youth and young people and adolescents have with social media, and what role does social media play and access? And I think we mentioned this, access to technology in the kind of the mental health and the well-being of young people during the pandemic. So does anyone have any thoughts or reflections or insights? Duncan?
Yeah, I'll come in. As people have been talking, I've been kind of thinking over something that Anna Laura was saying in her opening speech, which is about, resilience can come in many forms. And one of the forms that we know about is community. And one of the things that the pandemic has done is, by definition, because we've been trying to kind of reduce transmission of a virus, we've been forced to sort of, well, literally isolate ourselves from one another. And community my guess, I mean, I'm not a community expert, but my guess is community can take many forms for different people. And so whilst there's been a lot of, social media is bad, and the reality is that for many young people, social media is a way of forming community.
Absolutely.
And we talked about particularly disadvantaged groups like BAME communities, for example. But there are others, for example, the LGBTQ plus community, who, for example, I know many kind of young people who, their community at school or their community in university is their lifeline. And now they've had to go back home where they don't feel comfortable being themselves and they don't feel safe. And for them, their online world is their kind of lifeline community. And so the reason I think social media and kind of online activities is really interesting is because for some people, they're sort of a kind of a poor substitute for kind of interactions that they might have in real life. But for other people, those interactions are a real lifeline. I think especially if you're a relative minority in the community in which you physically live. So anyway, those are my sort of opening thoughts about kind of social media and the kind of more complicated role that it might play that's different for different people.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please, Anne Laura, please.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. I think that's a really important point. I just want to kind of highlight the fact that social media in itself doesn't really mean anything. There isn't a website called social media and that's it, right? There are many, many different online worlds that young people can reside in, that they can benefit from, but also that might have negative events. So it doesn't really matter. It's not really the social media aspect, it's more the what are they doing there. And those worlds can have really, really positive resilience boosting effects. So it really matters as to what are they doing online and with whom are they doing it.
Yes.
But that said, there is a research showing that 1 in 10 young people never feel safe online. So there's this really big kind of gap in our ability to help young people be more safe in the online world. And that is something that we need to think about, how we can better facilitate that, especially since nowadays the online world is playing such a big role in our lives. And we know that criminality, for instance, has shifted from the majority of online behaviors towards offline behaviors towards online behaviors. So there's this really important new question really is, so how can we actually address that aspect? How can we make young people more safe online in their various online worlds?
So, I mean, it can be beneficial, but there's a caveat that I guess we can't be naive to the reality that there is negativity, trolls, that there are people who might have nefarious intentions or...
Exactly, it's just like the offline world. It's just like the offline world, it's just a different context.
But to emphasize what Duncan was saying, it can be a lifeline. this kind of this connection. I loathe the term social distancing. I think physical distancing is more appropriate. So we're physically distancing, we're isolating, we're in a lockdown, but we can still connect with people. And I know this is anecdotal, but I'm very active on Twitter, and there's a huge online community of mental health advocates, and it's been immensely beneficial for my psychological well-being. Any other kind of thoughts, Brendan?
Yeah, I think the other thing about social media and all those is that it's such an information-rich world that young people are living in now, and that with if it's difficult enough for us to understand the complexity of what's going on now, and in particular, as Laura was saying, to understand what we can do and what's outside our power. And when you're looking around us and you can see all these conspiracy theories, you can be told that influencers are getting tens of thousands of pounds a week online, and why aren't you doing it? Why are you unemployed? Is it your fault or is it somebody else's fault? That's very difficult. And once people start blaming themselves for what's going on in the world, when young people are put in very difficult situations, that's dangerous for them.
Yes.
And to be able to understand that it's not them, it is a genuinely difficult environment that they're in, and that will get better. But the last thing they should be doing is blaming themselves. It's very easy to say these things, but inevitably, even in today's society, even knowing that unemployment is caused by these, bankers, by pandemics, by government actions, still people without jobs blame themselves, and that is something that we really need to get through. Try and see the bigger picture, but easier said than done.
Absolutely. Yes.
I might just jump in there very briefly if I could too, and I suppose I don't want to be the pessimist in the room at all. I really don't want to do that, but I suppose we also want to talk about social media as also a site of accelerated technology. And that accelerated technology puts pressures on young people. There's a lot of competition. I mean, I guess that's kind of the sociology of digital worlds and digital life and that sort of experience. And I suppose one thing we want to be thinking about there too is how some of the things that I was talking about, in the world of conflict, perhaps, and division, also lives there and is embodied in the digital worlds. And I think one thing that's going to be really important beyond critical digital literacy is a way of actually seeing kind of the forces that seem to have free reign and kind of hold on young people. And we do know, especially in kind of Twitter storms and things like that amongst young people, there's an awful lot of harm being done there. And in the context of a pandemic, that is exacerbated. So again, that the figure of the marginal young person, etc., being taken to some kind of other very harmful place, whilst in conversation in these storms and etc. And so just a, kind of cautionary note.
Yeah. And I think it's critical that you make that cautionary note. And I don't think you're being a pessimist. I think you're being a realist, because we can't be oblivious to the adverse effects that social media can have. And in my talks, I say life is what happens when you're busy using your smartphone, because it seems like many of us are addicted to especially the youth. So I think in moderation, but we should be mindful that it can be harmful. So I think it's been almost 20 minutes now, and I want to invite each speaker, and thank you all, but I want to invite each speaker, maybe is there like a closing take-home message that they would like to share with the people listening and attending the festival?
I have one.
Yeah, please. Thank you, Anne Laura, please. Yes, what would be your take-home message?
Well, if I can be the optimist in the room.
Sure.
So I think it's really important that we realize that resilience is dynamic and it can be boosted, which also means that if you haven't been resilient, or if you are not resilient at the moment, if you are having mental health problems, that doesn't say anything about your future. So you can become more resilient, and it will get better. You just have to have the right skills and resources and tools. And there are people out there wanting to help you. So I think that is really important, especially during the pandemic.
And cliche though it may be, it's okay not to be okay.
Exactly.
And seeking help as a sign of strength, it's not a sign of weakness. And recovery is a reality, right?
Absolutely.
It might not feel that way, but recovery is a reality for the many and not for the few. So
Yes.
thank you, Anne-Laura, for saying that. Anyone else would like to share some take-home messages?
I had some thoughts. Well, one
Yeah.
thought really, which was that maybe, and I know we haven't thought about it in these terms, and we haven't discussed it so much in these terms, but we've sort of been discussing it in a roundabout way, which is maybe this is a moment when we're sort of forced to ask some very deep questions about the kind of values that we've adopted in our society. So, for example, what counts as a success as a nation? You know, is it GDP, or is it how people are doing? Is it, you know, are we setting sky high expectations about certain types of outcome for young people and letting other kinds of outcomes, you know, slide? Are we putting our resources into things that will yield long-term benefits, even if that extends beyond anyone's term of office? And so maybe this is, you know, it's been sort of an awful situation that's been visited on us all, but maybe it's also an opportunity for us to ask some sort of deep and searching questions as a society and as a culture about how we want to do things in the future.
Wow, that's really profound, Duncan, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I think it is an opportunity for us to engage in introspection, and maybe to reevaluate what our values are. And I mean, people say that the pandemic has brought the worst out of us, but I think it's also brought the best out of us as well. So no, thank you for those thoughts, Duncan.
Yeah.
Brendan?
Yeah, no, I've seen there's lots of kindness. I see lots of people really looking after each other in a much more obvious way than before. But backing up what other people said, it is a difficult time and it will get better. And it's tempting. It's human nature sometimes at those difficult times to think there's something wrong with you, that you're not coping, and to rise above that and just say, yeah, it's, you know, it's been a difficult year for everyone, but it will get better. And possibly even because of this, maybe we've reached some tipping points, and it may give society, if it's handled well, an opportunity to make things better than, not back to how it was before, but actually better than it was before, because we realize what is important. As you say, mental health is much more important than whether you're you know, super rich or not. Mental health should be at the center of our goals for society, not an afterthought.
Definitely. Well, there is no health without mental health, and you know, I've been advocating that for a while now. So no, thank you, Brendan. And I think you've made an incredibly important point. It's essential, it's necessary, I would say, to validate that we're going through a tough time, but not to personalize, because there are systemic factors, that are the political determinants of mental health that Joe alluded to. And actually, that would be an opportunity for me to invite Joe to make some closing remarks and share some take-home messages.
Yeah, I think these are all really important contributions, and they're really helpful to understand. And I suppose the take-home message I think that's come from my work is, you know, and the work I do with my colleagues and my students around all the issues that we've been talking about, is questions of responsibility. That one of the things that we talk about, I think, Duncan, you know, is you raising, you know, questions about societal values. The crucial thing is to be having conversations about those values as we face acceleration in societies, as we face increasing pressures around privatization and the evacuation of public, and to ask questions about how we can invoke, you know, through forms of education, wider questions of responsibility. And I don't mean just responsibility in the here and now. You know, I don't mean, you know, saving people or any of that kind of language. I mean historical responsibility, recognizing what's gone on in the past, having knowledge about that, educating about people about those pasts, because that helps address complicity and the banality of kind of everyday life where we ignore the realities of others and other circumstances. And it also forces us to be oriented towards the future, you know, the horizons of the possible. And when we do that in solidarity across groups, in forms of political alliance, horizontally, we have a much better chance of, you know, supporting all the things that we're arguing for and the things that we feel we need to challenge.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you. So I guess my take-home message is to our youth and to younger people. I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, and I would feel like I was forgotten about. And I hope that this panel discussion and this session is a message to you that we haven't forgotten about you, that we care. And I know that it can feel that you, the government especially, but has let you down. And we need to validate, and we are validating, that you are going through an incredibly tough time. But as all of the speakers have said, we historically we've gone through some, we've triumphed in the face of adversity, and I have full faith that we can do that again. So protect your minds, protect your heart, stay connected, and we hope that the content in this session will equip you with the tools necessary for you to not only survive but to thrive as well. Thank you all. Thank you so much.